Hey guys, Pastor Alex here, and before we jump into the sermon, I just want to take a moment and say thank you so much for tuning in, watching with us today. We hope this blesses and encourages you, so enjoy the message.
We're going to be in Genesis chapter number 50 today. They'll put it up on the screens for you. If you don't have a Bible, that's no problem at all. We'll take care of it, but if you do want to turn there, we're going to be in Genesis 50. We're going to start in verse number 14. Read about 7 verses today. We're going to be talking about a guy named Joseph. And this is not to be confused with the Joseph of the New Testament, the Joseph of the Christmas story. We're going to be talking about a guy named Joseph, and many of you remember this one because he's the guy that had the robe of many colors that his dad gave him. So we're going to be in the Old Testament, Genesis chapter number 50, verse number 14. This is what it says. It says, after burying Jacob, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and everyone who had accompanied him to his father's burial. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now, and this is what they said. They said, now Joseph is going to show his anger and he's going to pay us back for all the wrong that we did to him, they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say this to you. Please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you. I mean, these guys are pulling every trick out of the hat that they have. Please forgive your brothers for the wrong that they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of God your Father, we beg you to forgive our sin. And when Joseph received the message, he broke down and he wept. And then his brothers came and they threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we're your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, he said, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? He said, you intended to harm me. You meant this against me for my evil, but God intended it for my good. He said, he brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. He says, so don't be afraid because I'll continue to take care of you and your children. And so he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. Joseph looked at his brothers and he said, now don't get me wrong. You boys are a whole bunch of punks, but it's okay because God worked everything out for my good. He says, so calm down. It's all good. Look at the person sitting next to you and tell them, say, calm down. Now look at that same person and give them the title to my message today and say, it's all good. It's all good. It's all good, baby. When I was growing up, I grew up in South Fulton, Tennessee. I grew up across the street from this kid named Seth. And Seth was about 6'2". He was a really stocky kid. Most people thought he was a fully grown man by the time he was about 15. And I'm setting you up because that's going to be important. He's huge, very strong, just one of those like cornbread and meat kids. And, straight out of the South. And Seth had this funny thing about him where once every 3 to 4 months, Seth would get a new hobby or he would develop a new interest. And whenever he developed that new interest or found that new hobby, his life would literally adapt and revolve around whatever that interest was. When he first arrived, he was all into heavy metal. Every shirt that he wore was like a cut-off Metallica shirt. He wore all black. He even wore those gloves with the fingers cut off. He was into it. That was who he was. He played Guitar Hero all the time. That was him, okay? Well, fast forward a few months. He's hanging out with us. Now, all he's listening to is rap at this point, and he loves basketball. He is wearing basketball shoes. He went and got a basketball goal. He's watching ESPN all the time. We're playing NBA Live like, 2009 at that point. Fast forward a few months from then. Seth is now a skateboarder. He is wearing etnies. He's got a skateboard. He is literally filing a petition in our city to build a skate park for us. I mean, he's sold out. He's a skateboarder. That's what he's going to do. Well, then 3 months from then, his stepdad, Carl, comes home with a punching bag. And so all of a sudden, Seth drops the skateboarding, he drops the basketball, and he drops all this. And now Seth is going to become a professional boxer. That's what he's going to do. That's what his life is about. He's getting up in the mornings and he's running. He's doing that thing where you drink raw eggs in the morning. He's actually doing it. He's doing push-ups. And all the time, basketball players will get this. If you're a basketball player, all the time, you like walk around slapping the top of doors, or you stop and you like shoot like that. Well, if you're a boxer, this is apparently what you do all the time. In every moment, it doesn't, when class is going on, when you're hanging out, it's just constant like air boxing thing. And one day Seth came over to my house and he knocked on my door to see if I was home. And I was, and so when I answered the door, and when I did, Seth was doing this air boxing thing. And he's like, breath and everything. This isn't just for like dramatic effect. Doing this thing. But then he goes to swing like this, and he accidentally drills me right in the face. And now Seth is huge, okay? I wish my dad could attest for me. Seth is a giant, strong kid. I was the opposite of that. I was skinny. I was dainty. There is nothing about me that communicated strong at all. So he swings back, and he doesn't mean to, but he drills me in the face, and it knocks me back. And without even thinking, I don't know where because my fight or flight syndrome is normally flight, just to be honest with you. But without thinking in this moment, I was like, I go to hit this guy with a haymaker. I hold nothing back. It's not like, bro, no. I am going for the knockout in one swing. And I go and I hit him, or I go to swing and I miss. Thankfully, I missed. I'm not a boxer like Seth, so naturally I missed whenever I swing. But I missed because Seth and all his boxer reflexes, he backed up like this, hands up and everything. I still remember. He backs up like this, but when he does, he falls off my porch into this big bush thing, and he scrapes his face all up. This big guy falling off my porch into this bush, scrapes his face up. He's bleeding on his arms, and I screamed something. I probably said a cuss word at that point in my life. I wasn't like living for God back then. I screamed something. I slammed the door in his face, and I go and I walk to my room. I'm all heated, and I'm all mad, and I sit there, and I'm just like, I'm like bleeding. My nose is bleeding. I already am not gifted with like the perfect nose. And so I'm like, of all places to hit me, the nose? Like, come on, man. And I'm just mad, and I'm sitting in my room, and then I cool off for a second, and I realize what I just did. And all this shame and this guilt starts sweeping over me because I know Seth is actually a really great guy. He's always been a really great friend, and I knew it was an accident. And so I worked up I dropped my pride. I worked up my courage. I go over to Seth's house. His mom lets me in. I go over to apologize to Seth, and when I do, I walk in his room expecting him to be upset like any normal human being when I pretty much pushed him off my porch and scraped his face all up. I walked in, and he turns around at me, and he's like, bro! This big smile on his face. He's laughing at me. He's like, dude, you just swung on me. And I'm like, I know, man. I'm so sorry. I apologize. And in the middle of my apology, Seth interrupts me. He goes, whoa, relax. He said, one, that was the weakest attempt at a punch that I've ever seen. He said, it would have tickled me had you hit me. He said, honestly, Alex, I'm embarrassed for you that you even had to do that, like that anyone actually saw you do that. He said, but two, he said, you opened the door to a punch in the face. He's like, I'm not mad at you. He said, honestly, I'm kind of proud that you punched me back. And immediately, without question, Seth totally forgave me. He said, relax. And this is literally what he said. He said, it's all good. No worries. It's all good. And that's the same thing that we find happening in Joseph's story when he's talking to his brothers at this moment. He's saying, boys, y'all are dumb, but it's all good. And it's kind of mind-blowing when we see Joseph say this, and you don't really understand why it's mind-blowing that Joseph is able to say, forget about it, it's all good, unless you know Joseph's entire story. See, I've learned that a lot of times people don't get you, who you are now, until they get to see who you were then, until they hear your story and all the things that you've gone through. And so I want to make sure we know who it is Joseph really is behind the guy that says, oh, it's all good. And for our newcomers today, and maybe for anyone who hasn't brushed up on the story in a while, I want to catch us up on it real quick. So I'll be very quick about this, but as a young boy, Joseph was clearly portrayed as his father's favorite child. I don't know what kind of psychological damage that does to kids, but you can see it happening in this story. He's portrayed as his father's favorite child, so much so that his dad goes and gives him this coat of many colors, this beautiful robe that none of his other brothers got, and a few other things happen. And these brothers get super jealous of Joseph and of who he is. And they get so jealous, they're not like tweeting about him or unfollowing him on Instagram. They get so jealous, they plot to kill him. I mean, from 0 to 100 as fast as they can. Man, we hate Joseph. Let's murder him. So they plot to kill him. And after an older brother kind of steps in, he's like, oh, that's not probably a great idea. We shouldn't kill him. Let's throw him into slavery instead. And so that's what they did. They sell him into slavery. They lied to Joseph's father about what happened to him. And so when Joseph goes into slavery, he ends up getting purchased by this guy named Potiphar. And he works for Potiphar for years. And Joseph does an amazing job at Potiphar's house. He gets promoted to all these different positions. And after years of incredible service, Potiphar's wife begins coming on to Joseph. She starts trying to get Joseph to sleep with her. And Joseph, being the man of God that he was, he refuses. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. And she goes, and she's so mad at him that she goes and she spreads a bunch of lies about Joseph. And when those lies get back to Potiphar, Potiphar doesn't even wait for a second. He immediately throws Joseph into prison for something that he didn't even do. Joseph finds himself sitting in a prison cell. And after he's been in there for a while, Joseph makes friends with Pharaoh's cupbearer, who happens to be in prison as well. And Joseph finds out that this cupbearer and this other guy, they're having some dreams. And so Joseph begins to interpret these dreams. And even though Joseph's interpretation of these dreams was spot on, and the cupbearer ends up getting out of prison, and he ends up getting to go work for Pharaoh in the palace again, when the punk cupbearer gets out of prison, he forgets about Joseph, and he leaves him rotting in prison. He just leaves him in there as if nothing happened. And I think at this point in Joseph's story, it's safe to say that Joseph probably didn't feel like he'd been given much of a fair chance at life, especially considering that none of the circumstances that he found himself in were his fault. And I think on some level, everybody in here can identify with that. Because everyone sitting in this room has experienced loss and pain and letdown and unfair situations that weren't always your fault, that you had nothing to do with. For some of you, maybe it was your parents' fault, and that's the truth. For some of you, maybe it was your pastor's fault, your teacher's fault, your coach's fault, your boss's fault. For some of you, maybe it was your ex's fault. I'm sure most of us can say, yes, my ex's fault. We can point to them. I did nothing wrong in that relationship. It's on them. It's their fault. I don't know whose fault it is, but I know, as a matter of fact, that probably every single one of us have been there. That spot, this is the spot, and I'm sure you've been there, where you're just like, God, why? Like, what in the world? Why me? Why are you letting this happen to me? Like, come on, man. Do you even care about me? What's going on? Are you real? I know surely I'm not the only one that's experienced that. And I know I'm probably not the only one even honest enough to say that that's been my thought. By a show of hands, we got anybody out there who's willing and honest enough to say, man, I've said, God, what's up? See, so some hands went up. And for all of you who raised your hands, and for even those of you who didn't, that's okay. I want to take a moment and remind us that Joseph was a human just like us. And there is no doubt that these exact same thoughts plagued his mind for about 17 years. Kidnapped, lied about, betrayed, sold into slavery, put in prison, forgotten about in prison. God, what's going on? Where are you? Like, did you forget about me? You're leaving me hanging? Why is this happening? And then one day, Pharaoh starts having dreams. And he starts asking for an interpreter. And that cupbearer, he remembers, oh crap, I forgot. And he points Pharaoh to that guy that he met in prison who interpreted his dream. And so when Pharaoh goes and he tells Joseph his dreams, Joseph interprets it, and he interprets it so well that Pharaoh gives him literally the most massive promotion of all time. In one moment, Joseph went from being a slave prisoner to ruling the entire country, to being second in command with the only person over him being Pharaoh. I mean, that's a big promotion. And through these dreams that he interprets, God begins to reveal to Joseph that there's a famine on its way, headed to Egypt. And so Joseph starts preparing for this famine, and he prepares so well, and he stores up so much food over a period of time that once the famine arrives, Joseph literally ends up saving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, because the famine wasn't just in Egypt. It says the famine had swept across the entire known world. In fact, the reason that his brothers ended up traveling to Egypt is because of this famine. The same brothers that just kind of assumed that Joseph was dead and gone, they hadn't heard from him in 30 plus years, they end up having to travel all the way to Egypt and ironically end up standing in front of Joseph himself. Now they don't recognize that it's Joseph, but they have to stand in front of Joseph and they have to beg him for food. And if you know the story, Joseph puts him through a series of tests, and then eventually he reveals his true identity to his brothers, and then he moves his entire family to Egypt, and he reconnects with everybody, and he reconnects with his father after 30 plus years. So when we get to the spot of the story that we're reading today, you got to know that's who Joseph is. That's what's made him up. Those are the puzzle pieces that has made his life up. And when we arrive to Joseph's story right now, we see that his family has been living in Egypt with him for years. Things have been going good, and then all of a sudden, Joseph's father, Jacob, unfortunately, tragically, passes away. Now, thankfully, he's a pretty old guy, so he lived a long life, but he passes away in this moment, and when he did, his brothers just kind of assume, well, now that Dad's gone, the smackdown is on its way. And so, in an effort to save their tails, while Joseph is still grieving about his father's loss, his brothers go to him, and they decide that in the classiest fashion possible, they're going to remind Joseph of Daddy's final wishes. Hey, Joseph, man, we know Dad's gone now, and you're probably really mad at us, but we just want to take a moment and just remind you that before Dad passed away, he made sure to let us know one thing. He told us, and we don't even know if he told him this or not, I don't think, but I said, Dad told us before he died, but make sure Joseph forgives you. Make sure Joseph knows to forgive you guys for being such jerks. And they're like, we're your slaves. We'll do anything. Don't harm us. And when that happens, we see Joseph, it says he wept. He was shocked because all of a sudden, Joseph realizes that his brothers still don't get it. And we get to verse number 19, and Joseph is like, whoa, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And like Seth did whenever I swung on him and knocked him off my porch, he looks at his brothers, he says, relax, it's all good. Don't worry about anything. It's all good. And then we get to verse number 20, and Joseph says this remarkable sentence. Like had Joseph tweeted this or put it on Facebook, we got all the shares that were going viral. Joseph would have been invited to all the conferences. He would have been speaking at Passion 2021 this year. And he says this, he goes, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Man, that's a verse. That's in fact, I'm going to read it one more time. He said, you intended evil against me, but God intended it for good. The evil that you meant, God meant it for good. Now, that's a word for somebody in here this morning. You need to hear that. That's a word for your life. And there's so much. This verse is so rich and it's so deep, and there's so much to unpack in this. But the first thing I want to note about this verse is how much I appreciate Joseph pointing out that everything that happened to him wasn't on God. Now, I can say that because he looks at his brothers and he said, all that stuff you did to me, he said, it was evil. And I'm assuming we all get this in here today, but in case we don't, God is not the source of evil. God does not write evil into your stories, okay? If something evil has happened to you, then it means God isn't behind it, letting us know that, wow, yes, God used it all for Joseph's good. Everything that happened to Joseph during that time, it wasn't God's perfect plan for his life. Why? Because there was evil involved. God's perfect plan never involves evil for your life. Now, I want you to write this down, what I'm about to say. If you have a phone, take a picture of the screen, write it down, because it is foundational concerning who we believe God to be. All right, write this down. God is not the source behind every single thing that happens to you. God isn't the source behind everything that happens to you. Now, I know for some of you this is a new concept, but God doesn't cause everything that happens to happen. Let me prove it to you. That's the whole concept behind sin. Sin is when we do something that God did not want us to do, meaning that now something has happened that God did not want to happen, meaning that God does not cause everything that happens to happen. It is that easy. And I know some of you are like, whoa, chill. Because God, I can hear it right now. God is sovereign. And God is powerful. And He controls everything. And to that I will say, absolutely, God is totally powerful. But in His sovereignty, okay, God loves us so much that He doesn't micromanage our lives and force us to do anything. Love never forces itself. That's rape, okay? Love lets people choose. God never forces us to do anything. He gives us options to say yes and to say no. And in the beginning, God gave Adam and Eve two options. He said, first option, you can say yes, you can obey me, you can do what I say, and if you do that, you'll live forever, you'll never die, you'll experience an awesome life, you can keep walking around naked in the garden, eating fruit with each other, naming animals for the rest of all creation. I'll take care of everything for you. You'll never have a worry in the world. But option number two is you can disobey me, you can sin, you can eat that fruit, and you're going to die. You're going to experience death and pain and misery and loss, and we all know the story. Adam and Eve chose option number two. They ate the fruit, they sinned, and you know what it earned them? Death. It earned them death. That's why we get to Romans chapter 6, and it says the wages of sin is death. Now, is a little bit of theology okay with you guys this morning? I mean, y'all want something deep, or you just want me to tell a few stories and then go home? Can I keep going? All right. That's what we like going deep, okay? And so when Adam and Eve chose sin over choosing to obey God, they chose sickness and death and murder and rape and addiction and depression, and they chose all of that over God's perfect plan. It's not that God is why does God let this happen? It's not that God let this happen. It's that God let us choose whether or not that it was going to happen, and we chose for it to happen. We chose sin and death over choosing God, and so when Adam and Eve did that, they didn't just choose for all that to happen to them and for the curse of sin to come on them. The Bible says when they chose that, they chose it for all of us. And so next time you have a headache, or you get in a car wreck, or you hurt your back real bad in the weight room, like I do literally every other month, I want you to take a second and just thank Adam and Eve for all the hard work they put in to make that happen for you. Because every bad thing that has ever happened to you is a direct result from their actions in the garden. I know some of you are like, why is that so important to know? Well, it's such a big deal to know that because it helps us understand that not all injury and disease and pain is from God. I know some of us believe that, but that's not true. It's not what the Bible says. Not all injury and sickness and disease is from God. That's why when we get to the New Testament, the gift of the Spirit is healing. It helps us understand that not every single death was sovereignly ordained by God Himself. That's why when we get to the New Testament, we see this thing called resurrection. God is a healer, and He's a comforter, and He's a good Father, and He gives good gifts to His children. Hear me, we don't experience disease and poverty and depression and murder because God wanted us to. That wasn't His plan for us from the beginning. That's not what God wanted. Look at John 10:10. Throw it up on the screens for us to read it. This is Jesus talking, and He says the thief's purpose, and when He's saying thief, He's referring to Satan and sin and evil, all that. He says the thief's purpose is to steal, to kill, and to destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. I don't know about y'all, but I don't think Jesus and Satan share the same job description. At any point in history, I don't recall Satan and Jesus sharing the same job description. And in this verse, Jesus draws a hard line between what his involvement in your life looks like and between what the enemy's involvement in your life looks like. We don't go through the crap that we go through because that's God's will for our lives. Bad things don't happen to us because God wanted them to happen. Bad things happen to us because we chose sin over choosing God. Every one of us has. Because Adam and Eve did it, now every one of us has. Now that's why Joseph didn't put it on God for all the evil and the hurt that he experienced. He didn't say, God was evil to me and he hurt me. No, he looked at his brothers and made sure that they knew, no, your evil selves did that to me. It wasn't God who did it to me. It was you who did it to me. You're the bunch of evil punks that put me through that stuff. But it's all good. You got to know in that moment, his brothers are probably thinking, it's all good. What do you mean? Because that's not how they rocked, man. They would have smacked Joseph so hard if they got the opportunity to. If that had been them in their position, there's no way they're saying that. So they're like, what do you mean? It's all good. What you talking about? And we get to verse number 20, and it says, it was all good because you meant evil against me, but God meant it for my good. Now that's one of my favorite, it's a life verse for me. But it gets even better when you begin to peel back the English and read that verse in its original language. Because when you go to the Hebrew and you read that verse and it says, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for my good. That word meant, it doesn't mean what we think it means. It doesn't mean meant. That word meant in that verse, it means to weave. To weave, like you're sewing. And so when Joseph says this, what he's saying to his brothers is, the evil that you tried to weave against me and the evil that you tried to weave into my story, God took that evil thread and he rewove it for my good. And I don't know about you guys, but that's my story, man. I remember getting a DUI when I was 16 years old and the enemy using that to weave embarrassment and shame and depression, and then God turning it full circle and using that DUI to weave it into me getting saved and into me encountering God for the first time in my life. And even more recently, I remember me and Sam moving from Alabama, leaving a life that we had been building for years, and the enemy took that move and he tried to use it to weave doubt and bitterness and anger into our souls. But then I recall God using that same move to put us in a position to pour into a bunch of high schoolers in Martin, Tennessee, and from South Fulton, Tennessee, and to use me to answer prayers that I prayed as a high schooler. And then I remember God using that same tough situation and setting Sam up for the most success that she's ever experienced in her career. And then I remember, I don't know if you guys remember this moment, but I remember God turning that same confusing situation into me getting to become the pastor at one of the coolest churches with the most amazing people in the whole world. I've seen it happen, man. That's my story. I can see where the enemy attempted to weave evil into my story, but I can see where God used it and he weaved it right back for my good. That is the story. God, if there's any story about overflow, that's the story of this church. What the enemy meant for my evil, God turned and he used it for our good. That's why we're here today. That's why this is happening. That's why you're sitting in those seats out there. And the truth is, if you put any effort into it at all, and you drop maybe a little bit of hard feelings toward God, and you let your pride come down a little bit, on some level, every single person in here can more than likely understand where Joseph's coming from. Because you can look back at that lost job and say, man, the enemy used that to weave a bunch of doubt into me and to spark fear into me. But God ended up resulting that lost job into a better job just a couple of months later. Now, sometimes we forget to notice that kind of stuff. And for some of you, you can look back on some of those hard fights you had in your marriage, some of the worst words, the meanest, nastiest things that you ever said, and you can see where the enemy used that evil moment to try and weave it against your marriage and to try and break your marriage apart. But then you can also see where God used it to spark some of the most healthy, honest conversations that you and your spouse had in months. Most everybody in here, if you put work into it, you can recall a moment where God has done that for your life, okay? You can go back and you can find that. And when we do, it's like we retell those stories and we love it. It's so much fun retelling those stories, and it gives us the feels, and we're like, oh, God is so good to me. Like he came through for us. But you want to know what I've noticed about those particular stories? Our tone while we retell those stories is a little bit different than our tone while we're in the middle of those stories. Anybody with me right there? Because when we're retelling it, we're like, oh, God is good. He came through for me. He's a provider. He saved my life. God, oh, I love you so much. But in the middle of the story, we're like, God doesn't care about me. God's awful. God, does he want me to get a divorce? Why hasn't he come through for me? I don't have this money. God, what's going on? God, where are you? See, in hindsight, it's always easier to recognize when God's turned an evil situation for your good. It's a piece of cake to share Joseph's "it's all good" mantra once you're far enough removed from the situation and you've seen God actually work everything out. But my best bet says that if you go and you talk to Joseph right when he was thrown into slavery and after he'd been forgotten about in prison, best bet says his tone toward his brothers and towards God probably wasn't the same. It's probably a little bit different than what we get at this moment in Joseph's life. See, it's so easy to hear Joseph say this and assume that he's just this man of faith. What a quote. What you meant for evil against me, God meant it for my good. You know, it's TV preacher material right there. He's doing that thing. What you meant for evil against me, God in his grace, he meant it. Come on, someone, for my good. He says that and we're like, oh, Joseph, he's so wise. Joseph, man, what a man of faith. This dude is awesome. But I want you to remember that Joseph only says that after the fact that God has come through for him. When Joseph looks at his past and he says, no, it's all good, he's not doing that in faith. He's just noting the reality of his situation, okay? It doesn't take any faith to look back and to say, oh, God worked it out for my good. That has nothing to do with faith, all right? Don't get it twisted. If you don't walk by faith when things get dark, then we're not walking by faith at all. That's what faith is. Faith is when you still got faith even when you don't see the answer. Dude, it's easy to have faith on the back end once God's already come through for you. But what about when your story hasn't come full circle? What about when you haven't seen the prayer answered? What about when everyone around you is being blessed and you're still struggling? What about when the healing didn't come? What about when Lazarus does die? What about then? Are you still full of faith? Or is your faith shattered? All of a sudden, is God's not real? Is everything that you've stood for all this time a lie? Or, in those moments, can you lift your head and actually live out the faith that you claim to have and say, even when the storms do show up, it's all good. And even when the enemy surrounds me on every side, it's all good. And even when I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, guess what? It's all good. And God, even if you walk me through the valley of the shadow of death, I still believe that it's all good because you told me that it was all good. And I believe you even when I don't see it happening because I believe that even though I don't see it, that you're still going to do it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is faith. That is faith. And that's what you're called to live by. Let me remind you, man, the lights and all this stuff is good, but the cornerstone of Christianity is faith.
Faith is everything. It's the power and the force behind every single thing that we do and why we do it. Jesus calls us to follow him in faith, and he calls us to live in faith, and we're saved by faith, and we're healed by faith, and we're supposed to worship in faith, and we're supposed to give in faith, and we're supposed to serve in faith. Faith is literally everything, man. That's what this is all about. In fact, let me show you how important faith is. Look at Romans 14:23. I just want you to look at the last sentence. Whatever is not from faith is sin. That's how important it is. Anything that you do that you are not doing in faith is sin. None of us complain in faith, right? No one's ever been like, oh, I'm a bagger. No, that's not faith. We don't complain in faith. We obviously don't doubt in faith. We don't argue with our spouses in faith. Anything that you do not do in faith is sin. You want to know what faith is? Faith is believing that it's all good before you ever see that it's all good. Faith is Elijah trusting God for rain even when there isn't a cloud yet. Faith is, the song, when you raise your hallelujah even in the middle of the storm. Faith is taking a stance that no matter what I see and no matter how I feel, that I can relax because God's promise to me is that it's all good. Someone say it's all good. That's it. That's his promise to you. And when we get to the New Testament, Paul shows us even more clearly what faith looks like. Look at Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28. This is Paul writing to the Roman church. He says this. He says, we know. Say no. No. One more time. Say no. No. There we go. He says, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Dude, Paul all but takes Joseph's concept and steals it, right? I mean, he is almost quoting Old Testament scripture at this point. Except there's one difference in Paul and Joseph, Daniel. When Paul writes this, Paul is still in the middle of his dark days. But when Joseph wrote it, all of his dark days were long gone. That wasn't the case with Paul. In the middle of the persecution, and in the middle of being wrongfully imprisoned, and in the middle of being publicly stripped and beaten and whipped, and in the middle of his friends getting murdered for the sake of the gospel, Paul has the nerve to write to the Romans, and he says, yeah, I know things look a little bit dark right now, but take courage because we know that God works some things together for our... No. He didn't say some. No, he said, we know that God works everything except for the things that we don't understand and they're really hard and we don't really line up with the Bible and I don't get this. Everything but those things together. No. That's not what he said. Now, that's what we think he said. That's what we convince ourselves that he said. That's what we let our situations tell us that he said. That's what we let the world tell us that he said, but that's not what Paul says, all right? Paul says, we know. Go ahead and say, we know. He says, we know. And when he says that, man, you got to know, when he says we know that all things are going to work together for my good. I love it, man. He says, everything, every bad thing, every good thing, every hard thing, every hurtful thing, every mean thing, every mistake, every victory, he's going to work every single thing for my good. That's the promise you inherited as a child of God, and that is the promise that you get to walk in when you started following Jesus, that every single thing is going to work together for your good. And he doesn't say, like I said a second, he doesn't say, I love how he didn't write, because most of us, we would have said, yeah, man, we're just over here. Man, I just hope God does something with this. Hey, this is tough right now. I just hope God comes through. He didn't say that. He didn't say hope, and that's intentional. Because hope is really good. These three things remain. Love, hope, faith. All that's great. Hope is good, but hope and faith aren't the same things. Okay? Hope, we'll start off with this. Doubt says, I don't know if God can work together for my good. Hope says, I'm optimistic that God could work this together for my good. But faith, which is the doorway to accessing everything that God has for your life, faith, it doesn't say I'm not sure, and it doesn't even say I hope that God's going to work it together for my good. Faith says I know that God is going to work everything together for my good. I know He's going to work it together for my good. Now hear me, please. Don't get me wrong today, all right? There are a lot of things that we don't know. We don't know how He's going to work it together for our good. We don't have the luxury of knowing how God's going to do what He's going to do. And we don't know when He's going to work it together for our good. We don't get a timeline of when it's going to happen. And we sure do not, a lot of times we don't even know what our good is. We don't even know what our good looks like in the moment once He has worked it together for our good. But we can rest easy because we do know at least one thing. We know because He already told us so that no matter what happens, whether my bank account is full or whether I'm broke, whether the prayer is answered or whether it's not, whether the healing happened or whether it didn't, whether in death or whether in life, we know that no matter what happens, at some point, somehow, some way, that God will work every single thing together for our good. And that's why in the face of any circumstance, we can look at our situation with confidence, and we can every time boldly declare that no matter what I see and what I feel, it's all good, baby. It's all good. Every time it's been good. That's my story. It's always been good. It's always going to be good. Is there anybody in here who could stand up out of your chair and declare that over your situation today? That it's all good. It's all good. Come on. Every person in this room with full of faith, every child of God, one last time before we sing today, shout this with me. Say, it's all good. It's all good. Come on. Let's worship, man.
Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in with us today. We hope this message blessed you and encouraged you. If you don't subscribe to our YouTube channel, be sure to do that. Click subscribe below. If you don't like our page on Facebook or follow us on Instagram, be sure to do that too. And if you want to give into the move of God happening here at Overflow Church, all you got to do is go to overflowchurchonline.com and it'll walk you through the steps. So we love you guys. We appreciate you tuning in with us. Have an incredible day.